We all grew up enjoying fairy tales that were sweet, magical, and full of whimsy, perfect for bedtime stories. We heard about brave princesses, happy endings, and heroes defeating villains. But what if I told you that those happily ever afters didn't start out that way? The original versions are dark, twisted, and outright disturbing. I'm Mike with List 25, and today I'm diving into 25 scariest fairy tales before they were sanitized. Trust me, you'll never look at Disney movies the same way again. But before we get started, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any new content. It truly helps the channel grow. With that being said, once upon a time. 25. Peter Pan's Darkening. When we think of Peter Pan, most of us picture that carefree boy all decked out in green who flies around with Tinkerbell at his side and fights off Captain Hook. It's all magic and fairy dust and childhood dreams. But that Disney version is far more innocent than the original. Peter wasn't always just a boy who wanted to live in Neverland. J.M. Barrie wrote the original tale, and it's much more twisted than the one we know and love. In the actual story, the Lost Boys do age while in Neverland. And to keep up with the demand for children instead of adults, Peter thins them out as they get too old. Yes, that's the actual phrase he uses. Does this mean they're kicked to the curb? Does he abandon them? Kill them? This horror is left to the imagination. The poor lost boys don't last very long in the real story. They're picked off by pirates, wild animals, and Peter's thinning. Growing up in Neverland isn't a childhood paradise, not even close. Peter isn't some fun-loving kid either. He's dark, dangerous, and has some serious control issues. 24. Maui's Mythological Demise. In the movie version of Moana, Disney made Maui a lovable demigod who sang fun songs and sported a magical fishhook. Everyone adored him. However, in the actual Maori mythology, Maui was a trickster god who met a truly terrible end. Maui wasn't content pulling up islands and lassoing the sun. He had ambitious plans to give humans the ultimate gift of immortality. But he had to defeat the goddess of death, Hine Nui Te Po, to pull it off. He knew this was going to be quite a feat, and came up with one of the most bizarre battle strategies you could think of. Do not think you're ready for this. Okay. He planned to transform into a worm and crawl into her body through her lady parts while she slept, and then pass all the way through her and exit through her mouth. He was convinced that this weird reverse birthing process would somehow conquer death. Unfortunately, once he started on his journey, things went completely sideways, thanks to the birds traveling with him. Legend has it that the birds couldn't contain themselves seeing this powerful god as a worm. The fantail in particular couldn't stop laughing, and their giggles woke up the goddess. Oh, and she wasn't just awake. She had a shocking defense mechanism that would probably have killed him either way. Maui died when the goddess crushed him with obsidian teeth lining her vagina. Yep, I said what I said. So that's why humans die today, because of laughing birds and a toothy trap. 23. Jack and Jill meaning. How many of us sang about Jack and Jill going up a hill to fetch a pail of water? And how many of you then threw yourselves down a hill because Jack fell down and Jill came tumbling after? It's weird when you think about it, but not half as weird as what some people believe this is traced back to. There's a theory that Jack and Jill weren't just some random children. Some folklore experts suggest they represent King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, and the bloody day the king was beheaded in 1793, and how, later that year, the queen lost her head too. He broke his crown when the guillotine came down, and she met that same fate mere months after. Could it be? Is this beloved nursery rhyme about the king and queen being murdered? This potentially gruesome political song was sanitized into a harmless little ditty that children have been singing for years upon years upon years. Kind of makes you wonder what other macabre songs and stories have been softened up. Don't worry, I've still got tons. 22. Wicked Mother Makeover. The wicked stepmother trope is a true fan favorite in nearly every fairy tale. You gotta have a villain, so why not make it the ugly new mom who forced her stepdaughter to scrub floors endlessly or eat poison apples? But what if I told you that in the Brothers Grimm stories, they weren't stepmothers at all? They were the actual biological mothers of the young ladies they basically tortured. The Grimm brothers published their collections of stories in the early 1800s, and people were not having it. The idea that a mother could be so cruel, hurtful, neglectful, and murderous did not sit well with the audience. From Cinderella's mother using her as a servant to Hansel and Gretel's mother dropping them in a forest to survive on their own, the horrific tales simply were not tolerated. Was it a bit too real for the audience? Did it hit a little too close to home? Maybe. The brothers decided to do some serious damage control and edit their fables. They swapped out all those mad mamas for deranged stepmothers instead. Motherhood was protected, stepmothers were the new villains, and all was right with these wicked stories. The readers ate it up. The downside? Well, now stepmothers are the ones who are villainized. Think about all the Disney movies featuring angelic and saintly biological mothers with horrifically bad stepmothers. It still isn't great, but hey, you can't have it all. 21. Rumpelstiltskin's brutal ending. Remember that weird little man who spun straw into gold and then threw a tantrum when the queen guessed that his name was Rumpelstiltskin? In the story we all heard, he stomped his foot and disappeared in a cloud of smoke. Well, not according to the Brothers Grimm. They had a very different ending for this man who made a deal to trade his wares for a baby. In the brothers' story, Rumpelstiltskin was actually quite calm about losing out on getting his hands on the child. He just sort of shrugged it off and vanished without any fuss at all. But of course, that wasn't exactly a dramatic end. The Grimms weren't about to leave it at that. So they rewrote it in 1857. In their final version, Rumpelstiltskin flew into a rage so dramatic that he stomped his foot so hard it got stuck in the ground. Then he grabbed his other leg with both hands and literally tore himself in half. Talk about throwing a fit. Was the blood and gore worth it? If you were the Grimms, then the answer is yes. They didn't see the point in writing a tale unless it was going to haunt the reader for years to come. 20. Scheherazade's survival tactics. This clever woman told stories for 1,001 nights to save her life, right? While most people think of it as a romantic tale, the reality is way more disturbing. King Scheherazade had some serious trust issues after catching his first wife cheating. He lost it and decided all women were betrayers, and every single one of them deserved to die. In his bid to rid the world of as many ladies as possible, he would marry a virgin every single day, then have her executed the very next morning before she could ever betray him. By the time Scheherazade volunteered to marry the maniac, he already murdered over 1,000 women. Yeah, you heard me right. He had killed 1,000 women. Scheherazade was essentially a hostage who used her wits to survive a serial killer. Every night she came up with cliffhangers so compelling the Killer King would spare her life and let her live one more day. She spun tales of Ali Baba and Aladdin, not for pure entertainment, but to avoid execution. Heartwarming, this story is not. Not even a little bit. 19. Hansel and Gretel Famine. Now, I talked about Hansel and Gretel back in number 22, but I didn't really get into the horrors that happened to these children in a story. In the fairy tale, these two small children left a trail of breadcrumbs through the enchanted forest, found a lovely-looking gingerbread house, and defeated an evil witch. It's all pretty whimsical and magical, sure. The real inspiration for the story is anything but lovely, though. This tale is the product of one of the darkest periods in European history, during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Crop failures from endless rain caused widespread starvation during medieval times. Whole families were dying of hunger. Parents faced the unthinkable choice to watch their children starve or abandon them in the woods and hope they would fend for themselves. Yes, this really happened, and it gets worse. It's thought that the cannibalistic witch the children happened upon derives from the reality of the time as well. There are documented cases of people turning to cannibalism during the famine when they saw no other choice for survival. Was this told to children so they wouldn't be as scared when their parents took them into the woods and left them behind? Perhaps. Sadly, this beloved fable is actually based on very real starvation, child abandonment, and cannibalism. Sweet dreams, I guess. 18. Goose Girl's Gruesome Punishment. This fairy tale is all about a story they wrote about a young princess who is betrayed by her maid and forced to switch places with her. The maid marries the prince, and the princess ends up tending to geese. And when the truth comes out, justice must be served. In the sanitized version of the Goose Girl, the maid is dragged off to the dungeon. But as you've probably guessed, that wasn't how the Grimms wrote it. They decided the maid deserved something much, much more severe. In their story, the maid was stripped naked and stuffed into a barrel that was lined with sharp nails. She was then dragged through the streets until she died from her injuries. To the brothers, this was the most fitting end for such a scandalous betrayal. Even by medieval standards, this was a brutal ending. 17. Bluebeard's Curiosity Warning. One of the most famous dark tales came out of France in 1600. The folktale of Bluebeard's wives still haunts children to this day. Unlike the others, this one never seemed to get totally toned down. What was supposed to end in a life lesson about curiosity killing the cat, or wife as it were, is really a horrific tale of an eccentric rich man with a strange blue beard murdering his wives and keeping their bodies as trophies, hoping to finally find one who would obey him and not discover his secret. In the story, he manages to marry a beautiful young woman and hands her the keys to his castle with one warning: stay away from one very small closet. Does she listen? No, of course not. What would be the fun in that? He demanded her beheading, but thankfully her brothers saved her before Bluebeard got his way. In Charles Perrault's original writing, Bluebeard was a seriously deranged serial killer who systematically slaughtered his wives and kept their corpses as trophies. He gave each new bride keys to every room in the castle except his trophy room, hoping to add to his gory collection. And this plan never failed, until his new wife's family fought back and he finally met his end. This tale of terror and woe was straight up about femicide and domestic violence that somehow became an epic adventure story of defeating a maniac that children grew to love. 16. Enchanted Red Shoes. When most people think of Hans Christian Andersen's The Red Shoes, they think of a story of magic and dancing. A little girl named Karen puts on the slippers and discovers they're enchanted and is then forced to dance endlessly, unable to stop until she repents from her vain and egotistical ways. That's not how it went down in the original story, though. The version Hans wrote is much more gruesome. Karen is a mischievous child who obsesses over the shoes and all but steals them. They become permanently attached to her feet, and as the dancing goes on for days upon days, she becomes so exhausted, she begs the executioner to amputate her feet, and he does. But that's not all. Even after her feet are cut off from the body, the shoes continue to dance with her severed feet inside them. Karen is left to crawl around on stumps as she finally begs for God's forgiveness before dying. Imagine reading that version to your kids. No wonder we toned it down over time. Talk about nightmare fuel. 15. Pot-winning Pig. In the story we all know of the three little pigs, that last piglet really outdid the big bad wolf. He built a brick house that the wolf couldn't huff and puff and blow away, and he not only saved himself, but also the two other pigs who managed to escape and sought refuge with their smartest friend. The wolf runs off in defeat after realizing he's been outwitted. It was heartwarming and wholesome. The actual story was anything but. In the original fable, those first two pigs didn't get away at all. The wolf blew down those first two houses and ate the pigs for dinner. While the third piglet still manages to outsmart the baddie, the wolf's end is anything but kind. As the story goes, the wolf snuck down the chimney, but waiting at the bottom was a pot of scalding water, and the wolf was boiled alive. And to make it even more disturbing, the third pig eats the big bad wolf. Isn't that really dark karma? 14. Silver Hair Tragedy. The tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears is definitely a moral lesson about not breaking into a house and making yourself way too comfy. She breaks in, eats their porridge, sleeps in their beds, and truly messes up their house. In some versions, she's run off by the bears. In others, even more sanitized versions, they find her and treat her like a guest. Either way, Goldilocks is safe in the end. However, in the original, so much about this fable has changed that it's hardly even recognizable. Robert Southey's 1837 story wasn't just different, it was downright disturbing. First of all, there wasn't an adorable little girl with the blonde curls. The main character wasn't even a child at all. It was an old woman named Silverhair. And she didn't stumble upon the home of the three bears, she broke into the house of three men. Much like Goldilocks, she does eat their food, sit in their chairs, and take a nap on their beds. But unlike the bears, when the men discover her, she doesn't get very far. She's chased from the home in a state of absolute terror and meets an absolutely horrific end when she falls onto a church steeple and is impaled. This wasn't a story with a cutesy moral lesson. This was one of a woman who paid the ultimate price for her misdeed. 13. Tom Thumb's Desert Adventure. The story that we're told of Tom Thumb is one of an adorable little boy who has whimsical adventures because of his teeny tiny size. He's clever and resourceful and outsmarts bigger opponents by proving brains beats brawn. He was the little guy who could. However, the original story is anything but wholesome. Not only was he called Tom Thumb, but he and his siblings never made it back from the woods to their parents, only to be abandoned in the desert afterwards. Charles Perrault wrote Little Thumb in 1697, and it was anything but a feel-good story. His story starts off much like Hansel and Gretel, with parents so desperate from the famine that they decide it's better to abandon their children than to watch them die of starvation. They take their 7 sons deep into the woods, knowing they'll never find their way back home. The boys stumble upon an ogre's house, who invites them in and plans to fatten them up and eat them. Little Thumb and his brothers trick the ogre into slaughtering his own 7 daughters instead by switching the girls' crowns with their hats. Then, when the ogre comes after them, they take him out. Nice save, right? But the boys don't stop there. The story concludes with Little Thumb stealing the ogre's magic boots and swindling the ogre's wife out of all their money by pretending they're holding her husband for ransom. In both versions, the tiny child comes off as a hero, but the stories are so different that they're almost unrecognizable from each other. 12. Tom's Fish Sauce. We all know the story of Cinderella and how she was mistreated by her stepmother and ugly stepsisters until she married a prince. In the feel-good tale, dreams are made of. But have you ever heard the Vietnamese version, Tom and Cam? It starts off pretty similar, with a sweet and loving girl being tortured by her cruel stepmother and stepsisters too, but this tale has more than one dark twist. In this version, Tom does have a similar life and goes on to marry royalty. Instead of a handsome prince, she gets an upgrade and marries a king. Sounds like a happily ever after moment, right? Yeah, it's not. Unlike in Cinderella, where her stepfamily fades into the background, this poor girl's kin wants revenge. The stepmother and stepsister Cam plot her murder, and they succeed. Tom, however, comes back reincarnated as different things. She returns as a bird, but they slaughter her. She comes back as a tree, and they kill her again. It's all very brutal. When Tom returns in human form and reclaims her throne, she decides to get creative and get her own justice. She has Cam killed and boils her body down to a fish sauce and serves it to her evil stepmother for dinner. The woman has no idea she's eating her own daughter until it's too late. Just Tom comes out on top, but this story wasn't about forgiveness or moving on. It was a tale of Tom making her tormentors pay in the absolute most horrific way, like Cartman and Scott Tenorman. 11. Pocahontas Performance. This one touches on one of Disney's biggest controversies, their portrayal of Pocahontas. In their storytelling, she was a young woman who fell madly in love with John Smith and helped bridge the gap between her native community and the settlers. However, the real story of Pocahontas and John Smith is absolutely horrific. John Smith's own writing details his relationship with not a young lady, but a very literal child around 10 or 11 years old. He describes her as lively and curious and wrote about her visits to Jamestown to entertain the colonists by doing cartwheels and playing games. Often without clothes, as the Powhatan people didn't see nudity as shameful or shocking. What's even worse about Disney's version is what truly happened to Pocahontas. John Smith didn't marry her. She was kidnapped by Captain Samuel Argall. She was held hostage for over a year while being forced to convert to Christianity. Her name was even changed to an English one, Rebecca, and the settlers married her off to John Rolfe. She was then taken to England as a curiosity to show off, and later died there at 21 years old. Disney glossed over all the tragedies of Pocahontas' life and instead spun a tale that had very little basis in reality at all. 10. Tin Man's Metal Identity. The Tin Man we know and love is a sweet fella who accompanies Dorothy on her epic adventure in the hopes of getting the Great Wizard of Oz to gift him a heart. In the end, he finds that he's been able to love all along. It's all very sweet and even tissue-worthy if you're a softie. The real story, however, is nothing but blood and gore. L. Frank Baum was the author of the Tin Man's disturbing background, and it was absolutely deranged. The Tin Man was a real guy named Nick Chopper, a woodsman who fell head over heels in love with a Munchkin girl. The Wicked Witch didn't approve of this pairing and cursed Nick's axe to chop off his body parts one by one every time he used it. First, it cut off a finger, and a hand, and so on and so on. Nick was smart though, and every time he lost a part, he simply rebuilt it with tin and attached it to himself. Eventually, his dismembered body was nothing more than tin, hence his becoming the Tin Man. But hold on, it gets worse. Eventually, Nick Chopper gets word that his human head is still alive, and elated, he tracks it down. But when they meet, the tin body and the head do nothing but argue about who the real Nick is. The story that we're taught is all about love, but it's really an identity crisis wrapped up in horrors. Not so fun when you get into it. 9. Feral child inspiration. Disney's version of the Jungle Book told the story of a boy raised by wolves named Mowgli who learns how to communicate with all the jungle animals. He has beloved adventures with Baloo the bear and Bagheera the panther. It was beautiful, it was heartwarming, and it truly showed the power of friendship. The theory behind the real-life inspiration for Rudyard Kipling's book, though, was absolutely heartbreaking. Mowgli was most likely based on a child from India named Dina Sanichar. He was discovered in 1867 living in a cave with a pack of wolves. Hunters happened upon him and named him Sanichar, meaning Saturday, for the day they brought him to a missionary orphanage. Sanichar was so feral by the time he was found that he never adapted to human life. In the 20 years he was in society, he never learned to speak and only communicated through gestures and animal-like sounds. He struggled to even walk upright since he was raised to live on all fours. The only human habit he picked up was smoking, which made his health quickly decline. He passed away in his 30s, and during his life he never truly belonged to the animal nor human world. 8. The Ant and the Grasshopper Fable. The story of the ant and the grasshopper has been used for generations to teach us the lesson that hard work pays off. The ant spends all summer gathering food and stocking up while the grasshopper plays. When winter comes, the ant is prepared and the grasshopper is left scrambling. It's a cautionary tale that is educational and fun. Aesop's fable was much harsher, though. His version shines a much harder and more realistic light on the consequences of poor choices. When winter comes, the grasshopper isn't given a choice to redeem himself. Hungry, he begs the ant for help. But the ant's response isn't to give Grasshopper a handout. Instead, the ant shows absolutely no mercy and lets the grasshopper starve to death. The moral of the story was not to expect a handout. Ever. Period. Leave it to Pixar to take this story and add its own twist. In A Bug's Life, the grasshoppers are turned into violent villains and the ants into heroes. It became a battle of good versus evil, as the ants fought to keep those pesky grasshoppers away from their supplies. 7. Emperor's Rainforest Destruction. Did you know that the Emperor's New Groove's premise wasn't just about him being turned into a llama until he learned to be a better person? The original script about Cusco was initially called Kingdom of the Sun, and it had a much darker premise. The concept for this movie had Emperor Cusco plotting to destroy an entire rainforest so that he could build himself a lavish theme park. One so massive, it would cause mass environmental damage and displace indigenous people. Disney was ready to go full on with this, until Sting put a stop to it. Sting was hired to write all the songs for the film, and he was seriously taken aback when he read through the project. So much so, he threatened to quit if they didn't rewrite the story. I mean, did they expect anything less when they hired an environmental activist? The final version came out much tamer, with Cusco wanting to build a summer home on a hill, much more planet-friendly and much more people-friendly. Leave it to one of the world's most famous rock stars to very literally make Disney sanitize their very own story. 6. Petrosinella's Newborn Demand. Rapunzel tells the tale of a girl with impossibly long hair who uses it to help her prince rescue her after being locked in a tower by an evil witch. It's a harrowing tale that ends with romance and magic and finding true love. The Italian version, Petrosinella, is quite the opposite. Giambattista Basile wrote it in 1634, and it tells a much more demented story from the very beginning. In this one, a pregnant woman becomes obsessed with a parsley that's growing in an enchanted forest. Her husband, eager to satisfy her cravings, steals the parsley but gets caught red-handed. The enchantress decides to cut the couple a deal. The husband can live, but they must hand over their unborn child. Shockingly, this seemed all fine and good to the parents, and they readily agreed. The enchantress takes off with her newborn and names her Petrosinella, and eventually locks her in a tower with no doors and no stairs, much like Rapunzel. Petrosinella eventually does escape with the prince, but it's not through a magical transformation, nor an act of love. She has to steal magical items to gain her freedom. This is one of the rare times the Brothers Grimm actually clean up a harsh story. They're the ones who transformed this fable into the story of Rapunzel we know and love today. 5. Juniper Tree. Now we're diving into one of the most disturbing stories ever published by the Brothers Grimm. Unlike so many of their others that were eventually transformed into fun, feel-good tales, the story of the Juniper Tree is so deranged that it's better to pretend it doesn't exist than even try to make it child-friendly. This story starts off normal enough for a fairy tale. A couple wants a baby, so they pray for this wish under the Juniper Tree. Imagine their joy when their wish was granted and the mother became pregnant. Sadly, this happiness does not last long. She dies during childbirth, and the father gets remarried to, guessed it, an evil stepmother. The new stepmother favors her daughter over her stepson, and things take a horrifying turn. The jealous stepmother lures the little boy to the chest, where she horrendously decapitates him. And sadly, that's not even the worst part. She ties a scarf around his severed neck, props up his body, and cooks his flesh into a stew that she serves to her husband that night. The stepmother's daughter sees all this and buries his bones under the juniper tree, where his spirit is then transformed into a bird that sings about murder. Townspeople take notice of this bird and begin leaving him gifts, one of them being a millstone. The bird takes that millstone and drops it on the stepmother's head, instantly killing her. The bird then transforms back into a boy and reunites with his father. The story may have a happy ending, but the vicious nature of the rest of it isn't exactly charming. 4. Pied Piper Migration Theory. The Pied Piper is already quite a wild ride. A musician rolls into town, saves everyone from a rat infestation, and steals all the children when the townsfolk refuse to pay him. In the most gentle versions, the children return to safety and the adults learn a lesson about keeping their promises. But did you know this fable is based on real events? Yeah, I know. Shocking, right? Let's get into it. This tale is based on a documented historical event in Hamelin, Germany. Records show that on June 26, 1284, a group of people described as children did in fact follow the piper out of town, and they never came back. It sounds strange, weird, and super creepy. However, there may be a reasonable reason for this. Some historians believe the children were actually young adults and families, and there's a perfectly reasonable reason they disappeared. At the time, German rulers were recruiting people to move east to countries like Transylvania and Poland. They sent colorfully dressed men, like the piper, to lure people with promises of land and opportunities. Unlike the rest of this list where things get sanitized, this one was given the opposite treatment. A story of a recruiter was turned into an epic tale where children were stolen away until their parents paid the debt. 3. Frog's Forceful Break. One of the strangest but sweetest fairy tales is The Princess and the Frog. In the Disney version, Tiana is tasked with kissing the frog to turn him into her perfect prince, and they live happily ever after. It's all about looking past appearances to find true love's inner beauty. Wonderful. It's not quite so lovely in the Brothers Grimm version. In their version, the princess is a spoiled little brat who loses her golden ball in a well, and the frog agrees to retrieve it on one condition, that he gets to eat from her plate and sleep in her bed. She agrees, but it's a trick, and she backs out of the deal out of utter disgust at the thought of letting this amphibian share her food or her bedroom. Well, she tries to back out anyway. When the frog insists she keep her word, she completely loses it and hurls against the wall as hard as she possibly can in a violent rage. That's the move that actually turns him into a prince. Oh, and if this wasn't twisted enough, they still do fall in love. So yeah, this rude, impudent, obnoxious princess does get her happy ending after almost killing the poor man because, despite it all, he loves her. Domestic violence just shouldn't be heartwarming. No wonder they changed the part to feature true love's kiss instead. 2. The 12 Brothers. This tall tale takes family dysfunction to a whole new level that makes most of our other unsanitized tales feel like a gentle bedtime story. It all starts with a king who wants a daughter so badly that he decides, if he gets his wish, he'll slaughter all 12 of his sons so she can inherit the kingdom. He is so convinced this next pregnancy will go his way, he even has 12 coffins built and ready to go. When the queen becomes pregnant again, the sons, knowing they'll be killed, flee into the forest in an attempt to hide and evade execution. And they were right to panic, because the child the queen was carrying was indeed a little girl. The baby is coddled and adored by her dear daddy her whole life. When she grows up, she learns of her 12 brothers who are on the run and decides to find them. Unfortunately, when she does, her life flips upside down. Just not in West Philadelphia. The brothers were transformed into ravens through some enchanted flowers, and the only way to save them is for her not to laugh for the next 7 years. The girl pulls off this amazing feat of silence. Unfortunately for her, the lack of humor makes everyone believe she's a witch, and she faces execution herself. Luckily, the date lands on the anniversary of the curse, and her brothers turn back into humans, and her life is spared. While the story has a happy-ish ending, it's full of trauma and is based on a father ready to murder all of his children and a daughter who nearly lost her life trying to save them. 1. The Little Match Girl. The final story on our list may be enough to break your heart, so don't say I didn't warn you. Even the slightly, and I do mean slightly, clean-up version of this one is sad. The Little Match Girl tells the tale of a poor child who finds comfort in her final moments and gets to be with her grandmother in heaven. It's kind of sweet on the surface, but have you ever really thought about how it actually goes? Hans Christian Andersen wrote this story in 1845, and it's truly gut-wrenching. This sweet little child is homeless, desperately poor, and literally freezes to death in the streets on New Year's Eve while adults walk past her without offering up even the tiniest bit of sympathy. The most horrific part isn't so much that she dies, but the context. The Little Match Girl was standing in the streets at night by herself, first of all. Adding to that was that she was barefoot, terrified to go home to her abusive father without money to give him, knowing he'd become violent, and to keep herself warm, all she could do was use the matches she was supposed to be selling. Each match gave her hallucinations of warmth and of food and visions of her dead grandmother, before eventually going out and leaving her worse and worse off than the match before. When she finally uses up the whole box, she is so cold and poor that she dies right there. While Andersen frames her death as the girl escaping her suffering, this story is one of child abuse, child neglect, and society's complete and utter failure to protect or even care about vulnerable children. There's no way to sanitize this. It's disturbing from beginning to end. And there you have it, friends. I've covered 25 fairy tales that prove all of our childhoods were built on a bunch of lies. Which one shocked you the most? Aren't you glad these stories were toned down before they became some of your favorite bedtime tales or Disney movies? If you did enjoy this list, weird. No, but you'll definitely want to check out our video on 25 funny ripoffs of the most popular cartoons. I'll link that 1 in the description box, and 2, it'll pop up here in just a few seconds. But before you go, time to test your knowledge. Who can answer this folklore question without looking it up? In Irish folklore, what happens if you step into a fairy ring? A. You gain the ability to see the future. B. You become invisible for 24 hours. C. You get trapped in the fairy realm. Or D. You turn into a toad until sunrise. Drop your answers in the comments, and let's see who gets it right. Alright, now that's it for today. Make sure to like this video if it completely and utterly ruined your childhood, and subscribe for more unhinged truths behind stories you thought you knew. Hit that bell so you never miss out when we drop our next mind-blowing list, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya. Gonna go read some bedtime stories.